Welcome to Reef Rebels, where we explain why the Great Barrier Reef is absolutely fabulous. Well, it's not just climate and starfish that are supposedly killing the reef, it's also being smothered by mud. In the last episode, we looked at the crown of thorns starfish scare. When scientists first started studying the reef in the 1960s, they noticed huge plagues of starfish eating the reef. We now know that these plagues come and go, and the reef recovers brilliantly, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that their plagues are completely natural. But in the 1990s, a second scare arrived. It was mud from farms and dredging of shipping ports smothering the reef. There's not much doubt that rivers flowing to the coast adjacent to the reef are now carrying much more mud than before agriculture started in the late 1800s. And there is also more mud from port dredging. This is the requirement to dig deep channels to allow large ships to come close to the ports, where the sea is very shallow. So is all this mud killing the reef? Well, to cut a long story short, no. It turned out to be much less of a problem than even coral-eating starfish plagues. Now, for me personally, mud and the reef have occupied a large amount of my research career. This is how I first got involved with the debate about whether the reef was dying. Being a physicist and a technical person, my research included development instrumentation, measuring all sorts of interesting parameters in the ocean. And one of these was the concentrations of mud in the water. So my team at JCU's Marine Geophysics Laboratory and I invented the first instruments to measure over long periods concentrations of sediment. Our equipment was the first that could be put out onto a reef for a month or more and measure how much mud was in the water. Now, the instruments used a well-known optical principle that fires a beam of infrared light into the water, and if there's mud in the water, the light bounces back and you measure that. But the trouble with these sensitive optical systems in the ocean is that after a couple of days, when it gets covered with a little bit of algae, it becomes effectively useless. Actually, if you leave it there for too long, corals start growing on it. We had that happen a lot. Anyway, our main technical man, Peter Smith, made a little windscreen wiper to clean the optics. It wasn't rocket science, but it was a little bit of a revolution. So in the 1990s, we were able for the first time to measure properly what caused large amounts of sediment on inshore reefs and whether dredging and farmers were causing a problem. Now, we also worked with a group of marine geologists for many years, and by the time I was fired from James Cook University in 2018, our group had more measurements of mud in the water next to the Great Barrier Reef than all the other groups put together, by far. The alarmists claim that mud running down the rivers from farms flowed out onto the reef, smother the coral or reduce light levels, thus killing or damaging the coral. But our work showed that yes, a little bit of mud gets out onto some of the reefs close to the shore, but it's insignificant compared to what is naturally resuspended from the seabed close to the reef. What we found that it was waves caused by strong wind that ultimately caused the muddy water, and even this only occurred on the fringing reefs close to shore. So, for example, these pictures show the muddy water. You can see the waves which stir up the seabed. And the geologists proved that the mud on the seabed had actually been there for thousands of years. It forms layers, in many cases, many meters thick on the seabed. So for the last few thousand years, every time the wind blows strongly, roughly every couple of weeks, the water goes muddy. Compared with this natural resuspension of sediment, the effect of rivers is maybe 1%. So small as to be impossible to measure and certainly irrelevant. Marine geologists we worked with, like Piers Larkham and Ken Wolfe, also drilled cores in many of the inshore reefs and showed that the reefs have been muddy for millennia. As you drill down, effectively you can look back in time and the coral was surrounded by mud even thousands of years ago on some of these inshore reefs. The inshore reefs have evolved with different types of coral that can easily handle the sediment. And let's not forget that the inshore reefs are not the Great Barrier Reef, which is far offshore, and they only have about 1% of the coral that's on the Great Barrier Reef. If we look at the reef proper, it turns out that there's virtually no mud there at all. These white areas you can see in this picture, which are completely ubiquitous on just about every reef, that's calcium carbonate sand made from broken down coral, mostly. Because mud from the land has a completely different chemical composition to the coral sand, it's easy to determine that there's no doubt that these reefs have almost been totally unaffected by mud from the coast. The water is incredibly pure here due to the massive ocean currents that sweep into and out of the reef. But what about pictures like these, which hit the news right around the world just a couple of years ago? It shows mud getting out to the Great Barrier Reef, no doubt. But how much and how often? Now, it turns out this is the absolute worst case scenario. The biggest river, the Burdekin River, in a very big flood, the wind blowing in a particular direction, which was unusual, so the plume went offshore, and it maybe affected 3 reefs for just a few days. It turns out that most of the mud drops out of suspension close to the river mouth. These areas certainly contain lots of mud, but as the river water mixes with the seawater, a remarkable process called flocculation starts to occur. The small particles of mud start clumping together by an electrostatic process and rapidly settle out. So in this image we can see that the water close to the reef has lost most of its mud, although it is still discoloured. If all that sediment had fallen out, it would form a layer just microns thick. The water looks dirty because of the tannins in it. These are organic compounds that dissolve out of leaf litter and the like. The water is coloured in the same way that tea is coloured, but this doesn't settle out and it's not poisonous or harmful in any way. So although these pictures were flashed around the world supposedly to prove that the reef was being in danger, they actually proved the opposite. This was the worst case situation, which might only happen once in a decade, and it only affected 3 out of the 3,000 of the reefs of the Great Barrier Reef, and only for a few days, and the amount of mud was basically irrelevant. And that's it. The reef is not in danger from mud from farms, and neither are the inshore regions. They have lots of mud around them, but that's the way they've always been. What about dredges like these? My group took measurements around dredge operations since 1993. We had tens of millions of measurements. To cut a long story short, the effect of dredges only gets a few kilometres away from dredges. Places like Magnetic Island, which is close to a dredging channel, they generally have small fringing reefs around them, which have always been very, very muddy. The extra effect for the dredge might make, again, maybe a 1% increase in mud. But for the offshore reefs, which are a long way from any dredge channel, the mean distance from any reef to any particular dredging operation would be hundreds and hundreds of kilometres. The effect on them is basically zero. And let's not forget that North Australia, it's not like it's a big industrial area, and there are not many ports and there's not much dredging. So yet again, dredging of mud from shipping channels has almost no effect. So more great news. Of course, it was right to worry about mud flowing down rivers from farms, and because soil erosion is just bad, we should minimise it for the farmers' sake. But it's not killing the reef. I used to be very concerned about the impacts of dredging, but after a couple of decades of research, it's become apparent that the impact is effectively negligible. So yet again, the future of the reef looks extremely encouraging.